evening. Welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 4, Episode 15, where I, your host, Lindsay Law, I'm joined by Andy Law, games designer and cartographer, and Mark Gibbons, artist extraordinaire, concept artist, scribbler, and general seer of sites. And in any moment now, we will be joined by artist, writer, designer, director, Jason Wilson.
It's terribly unprofessional of us. We were nattering ahead of time a little bit, and like, we gotta go to the video, and then we've come back a little earlier than expected.
Well, we've come back exactly at the point expected.
Yeah, there he is.
Hello, Jason.
Hello.
Oh, slight crackle there. So I'll also add a quick little bit from our side. Jason has had some technical issues with the sound, so there's a possibility we'll have some crackles or some weird stuff. And if that happens, we'll just muscle on through and it'll be okay.
It's the joys of live TV.
It is indeed.
It is. So welcome to the stream, Jason. We're very happy to have you here.
Very happy to be here too.
So I'll hand over to Jason to introduce himself, and then we will jump into, as always, the questions that we've had pre-submitted from patrons in the Discord community. And as always, if you're in the comments section, chuck in your comments and your questions, and I will bring them up on the screen. And in the interest of those who may or may not be able to see said screen, I will also read them out. So, Jason, welcome to the stream. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, as long or as short as you like?
Hi, I'm Jason Wilson, and I've spent many decades in the video game industry. And I popped out of the industry for a short while to create original comic books and graphic novels with a kind of environmental, ecological sort of theme to them, running through them. The first one was Surface Tension, which was about a waterborne virus that sparks a pandemic that causes the infected to become known as the seasickness. And people afflicted with the seasickness have this overwhelming urge to head out to open water, to the sea. No matter how inland they might be infected, they just all en masse migrate to the coastlines and disappear into the oceans. And in the story, 1 year later, a group of survivors are trying to kind of scratch out of an existence on one of the British Channel Islands. When two islanders return, they crawl ashore from the sea and they have no memory of where they've been for the past year. And the islanders take them into their community and quarantine them because they're not quite sure what is going on here, because their pigment seems to be a blue color and they've somehow kind of evolved and they're changing. And the mystery is, are they mankind's savior, or have they returned to destroy mankind? So that was Surface Tension. That was the kind of water element component in my ecological duology. And the second book is Coalface, the Devil in the Smoke. And if Surface Tension was water-based, this is earth-based. And it's set during a winter of an economic recession and fuel poverty. And it's centered around a group of teenagers who all have absent fathers, absent parents. And they're home alone, they're hungry, they're cold. They're having to live off charity food banks, and they think the only way they can get out of the situation is to make a video game. It's their idea of escape from their kind of the kind of like ailing working class town, which is soon to become a ghost town. But unbeknownst to them, something dark and sinister and dragon-like has crawled up from the local coal mine and is beginning to kind of spread its influence through the smoke throughout the village. And the teenagers then have to fight this creature, which represents all sorts of things, such as the fossil fuel industries and everything that we're facing today.
There's some familiar themes there from our daughter's UCAS essay that she wrote to get onto the games design course in Aberdeen. So, sorry, no, there wasn't. We don't live in fuel poverty yet, thankfully. But yeah, it's close. Yeah, and Seagoat has said the same thing. Too soon, Jason. Winter, recession, and fuel poverty on point as a game for today.
Well, unfortunately, the story was written a very, very long time ago. My background, I should have explained, is my father was a coal miner. And he was a coal miner during the very it seems like long ago, but it's short history still to a lot of people in the UK. The infamous year-long coal miners' strike of 1984/85, when the vast majority of the workforce across England, Scotland, and Wales went on strike, there was seen to the UK for younger viewers, which is almost like a civil war. You had on these medieval kind of battles between armies of the police, they're all in different kind of rank and file with horse cavalry, or with their kind of armor on, and then you had all the miners who looked like almost like the sort of the peasants trying to besiege a medieval castle, and the castles were the coal mines and the power stations. So it's very important in the fantasy of the story Coalface, is because it is a fantasy story. I wanted to take reality and contemporary looking things like coal mines and power stations, but skew them through the prism of fantasy. So collieries started to resemble castles, and villages were the villages around the castles, and the police represented knights on armor, and the miners were the peasants fighting back, and the dragon is the fire at the heart of the story that is kind of bringing these two sides into conflict with each other. And it's about people who are all they're trying to do is exist and survive and have an economy and jobs and feed their kids. But the problem is the economy is also driven by fossil fuels, which is dangerous for the environment. So you have this tension in the story. And the dragon, it's a dragon in quotation marks, because it's not actually a dragon, it's something much more sinister, is beginning to exploit the situation, exploit the poverty of the people who are trying to fight for their jobs, but turning them into a kind of a darker ideology and a darker politics. It's trying to say, I can make your village great again. I can give you jobs and warmth and security, but only if you do what I say. And as long as you feed me and make me more powerful, maybe I'll make you powerful too. And obviously, as we all know from current political situations in the US and across the world, those kind of truths are not quite truths.
Fascinating stuff, man. So you've got it, and in the next week or two, the book's actually going to be available, isn't it? Because you've got.
Yes, it was going to be launched Monday this week, but it slipped by a week because unfortunately I fell foul of Brexit. Speaking of
Yes.
Oh no. Yeah, we all know that one very well.
Yeah, it seems like I slipped into this because I've been writing the story for a very long time. I originally came up with the idea when I was a very hungry child when my father was on strike, and we actually were having to eat from sort of charity kitchens that were started up to support the mining families, because a lot of people don't realize this, but when you go on strike, you do not get paid. So when we're at the moment, we're seeing a whole wave of industrial action because we seem to have returned back to the 1980s in terms of everything that's going on. So when teachers, railway workers, and so on, when they go on strike, they are not paid for those days. So imagine going on strike for over a year.
Yeah,
a lot of these families were torn apart. The kids went hungry. They had to rely on charity handouts, and I was one of those kids. And that's where I suddenly got the idea of, what if there was a monster living down the coal mine, but the monster was getting more and more hungry because the coal wasn't being dug and it comes to the surface. And that's when I first had the idea. I evolved the idea beyond that. And then I pitched it to publishers 5-6 years ago, and every publisher out there said, "Oh, it's a nice idea, but I don't think anybody's going to be interested in that sort of subject matter, Jason." And then, unfortunately, the world kind of caught up with the story, and we're now living the scenario that I've been writing about. So it suddenly became incredibly topical, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, we could do a whole nother stream on short-sighted publishers. We've all had to deal with that sort of stuff.
Sorry, they're very risk averse, because like any kind of entertainment industry at the moment, they're all scared that they're going to go out of business. So they're taking very safe, fashionable bets, and their audiences are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And I understand the business side of things, but at the same time, it's a shame that we can't have a wide range of stories. And it was very important to me to write a story. I'm proud to say it, kind of from a working class background, and talk about what's going on and how people get exploited and why they do turn to things like the Trumps and the Brexit and the terrible politicians of the world, because they want to believe that someone is out there to help them. And unfortunately, there's a lot of exploitation is going on, and a lot of exploitation of these situations. And we're seeing the tensions pulling again. I was fascinated by the situation in Germany. I was in Germany last year, and I saw lots of protests because 2 years ago, Germany voted for a predominantly green government. And Germany is mostly made up of coalitions, but the predominant party was a green party because Germany wanted to pivot toward cleaner, renewable green energies. But unfortunately, they voted in the green government just before the terrible situation with the Ukraine-Russian war. and we're all having to cut off our sort of addiction in a way, our cheap way of getting energy, which was from Russia. And all the energy companies were doing this. And unfortunately, Germany couldn't pivot to its renewables and green energies quick enough. So they had to open coal mines, and they had to ship coal to their ailing coal power stations in order to supply power to their people over a very cold winter. And during the summer, we had the hottest records, hottest summers in history. And the rivers in Germany were drying up, and most of their coal is shipped by river. So because of the environmental conditions with the heating up of the planet, they couldn't ship the coal fast enough down the rivers because there wasn't enough water for their barges to get the coal to the power stations.
Yep.
So it's almost like we made kind of like a Faustian pact with fossil fuels to kind of like keep our lights on and power our computers and keep us warm during the winter, because it's the cheapest way to get fuel, because we're in the pockets of energy companies. And now we are paying the price. And that's the story is a fantasy, and it's aimed at younger readers. But beneath the fantasy is the subtext of what is going on now with this sort of Faustian situation with energy. And that's why it's called The Devil in the Smoke.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by the 1980s. We could have a whole stream talking about unions and the impact of the European Union, and how now we're not in the European Union. In a way, unions have got to make their resurgence to protect employees' rights, because we've all got I think personally, we got kind of used to the European handing down those rights to us. But what was interesting to me about the 1980s was, at the time, so I talked to young people about some of the laws that were passed in the late 70s. So up until the late 70s, a woman couldn't get a loan in a bank without having her husband or her father sign off on it. And it was only changed because, essentially it was changed in like 1979, because it was fundamentally farcical to have a leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher, who might be about to and did become prime minister, who could appoint the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but if she wanted a personal loan, she would have had to get Dennis to sign off on it. And when I talk about that and say like, oh well, it was late 70s, the people who are coming into banking today are like, yeah, but that was forever ago, like that's irrelevant now. I was like, no, but you have to understand that there would have been people now who are finishing their careers, who influence bank policy and the way banks work, who literally started in bank branches when they could turn down finance for women.
Absolutely.
And in the 80s, what was really fascinating, so I didn't have a television. My mum and dad weren't particularly, we weren't rich, we were quite, but they wouldn't have called themselves working class, in that they wouldn't have voted Labour.
Yes.
Like that weird dichotomy that some people have. And so for me, those strikes it was like bad people who were disrupting things. And it was only, so I then studied history, I studied sociology. When Billy Elliot came out, and I was sitting in the cinema with Andy watching Billy Elliot, and there's a scene in Billy Elliot where his big brother is running through the houses, and they're basically having a pitch battle with the police, and like tears were pouring down my face, and it's like the Clash London Calling is playing, and I was like, I didn't know they were literally fighting for their right to feed their family and to live and work, because then all the news you got was controlled as a kid by a small number of TV channels or your parents. And I didn't know that, and I felt like really awful. I don't know what 8-year-old Lindsay could have done, but whatever. I did feel bad.
No, and I think that's fascinating, because to some people it is history. It might as well be the Victorian era for some younger readers and viewers and video gamers, but it wasn't that long ago. And all the rights that we have for everything, for LGBT, QT, women, even men, workers, people in general, had to fight for those rights.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a long history of people smashing stuff up to get those rights. I mean, we talk about things like the Luddites, which now is a bad term, oh, you Luddite. But when you read the history of the Luddites, it's actually it's fascinating that they were standing up against mechanization, which you can't stop. You can't stop things that's going on now with AI and so forth. We're going to have a transition period in the near future where we're going to have to sort out these problems. Where you've got a workforce that can't work, but we still have to pay our way in life to pay our bills. And that was what was happening then in the Industrial Revolution. It was the same situation. It was happening to be oil and steam machines that were taking away jobs, and suppressing workers' wages because the factory bosses could get machines to the job of 50 people and so forth.
And because the workers didn't own the means of production, that would have been okay if the workers had workers' collectives that owned the means of production. Like, it's okay to mechanize work if you can benefit from that mechanization. But of course they couldn't.
And it's one thing I talk about in the Coalface, the book, because the teenage characters are having to study the Industrial Revolution, so you get into some of the background of their forefathers and mothers, generations before, and they learn that in the Industrial Revolution, all workers, they didn't own their houses, they couldn't own their houses, they were owned by the factory bosses. If they didn't like conditions or complained, they could be turfed out of their houses. They couldn't vote. There was no voting in the UK. Only people could vote were the people who owned a house, and the workers weren't allowed to own a house in order to suppress them and keep them down. So they had to protest, and there was some terrible battles, and a lot of people died in order to get the rights that they had. Otherwise, powerful people will just sit on people and say, well, we pay you, you do what we do. And so, it's very important that all minorities and all people and everyone band together, because people will exploit you, unfortunately. And that's history is.
Yeah, it is fascinating, because we were learning about the Industrial Revolution and learning about how, children weren't allowed to work slowly but surely. Originally they were in mills, and then they limited the amount of time they could work, and then they weren't allowed to work at all, and then they had to have schooling, etc., etc. And then it sort of came round again that you could work, but only like not before X more on your school day morning. But the bizarre thing about that was, and one of our daughters is learning a bit more about the social reforms of the Liberals in the late 19th century. One of the fascinating things about that is it's taught like it just happened, like it was easy. Like, everyone just said one day was like, yeah, of course we shouldn't have children in our factories making things for us that make us money. Like, it wasn't like that. And like the suffragettes, the same thing. And then I relate that to today, to like Colin Kaepernick and people taking the knee in American football. Like, everyone thinks that if it was in the civil rights era, or if it was the suffragettes, or if it was the Industrial Revolution, that they would be the ones that were fighting. But those are the very same people who have lost Colin Kaepernick his livelihood. It's like, you wouldn't have been fighting. It's hard. Like, revolutionaries are heroes, and we wouldn't all be heroes.
Yes, exactly.
No.
Yes,
anyway, we'll get into some questions.
it's very heavy. It's a story about a big dragon that's smashed.
Yeah.
So we could go into what is eco gaming, but actually I want to jump in. Yeah, let's do that one first. It's very general. So we talked about eco gaming in the title of your session. So Seagoat has asked, like, what is eco gaming? How would you define that?
Ooh, that's a tricky question, to be honest. What is eco gaming? Off the top of my head, I find I struggle to think of eco gaming. The only thing that springs to mind is the old Sega game, was Echo the Dolphin.
So I came prepared, Jason, you'll be pleased to know. So my very first experience of a game that raised environmental awareness was a Ravensburger game called Wildlife Adventure, designed by Kramer and Kramer. It was, I like to think, the forerunner. It was published in like 1986, the forerunner of Ticket to Ride, an early Ticket to Ride. So you got cards that were like endangered animals, and you got little tracks, and you had to put these down on the track, and you had to go around the world and make your track to pick up the animals that were endangered. And through that, my brother and I learned so many animals and where they came from, which has proved useful when I've been fighting my family at University Challenge since. And that was our first experience of a game being a game and having a really good mechanism to enjoy the game, but also informing you of things. And in the late 80s, when that was published, the WWF was getting quite big. We were all at our primary school and our secondary school, we were all making discos to buy rainforests. I don't know what happened to those rainforests, but hopefully they still haven't been cut down. So yeah, that was my first experience of eco gaming. I'm keen to see if anyone in the comments is of the same vintage and also played Wildlife Adventure. But I think, what do you think about, I'll just go, do you think that environmental issues are underrepresented in the gaming industry? Do you think they're getting more attention now?
Personally, I would say yes. I would probably say where that probably sparks most interest is probably in indie gaming, I would imagine. I can't imagine any of the big AAA companies necessarily considering that. It's more about burning down.
Well, I mean that's because that's what I was going to say. Because certainly, the consequences of not of irresponsible planet management is a backdrop for like 50% of video games, isn't it? Whether it's The Last of Us or any kind of post-apocalyptic world where the game is set. It's like, well, that's because we as mismanaged the planet, and because some eco disaster happened or some zombie plague, and we're now living in the wastelands as a consequence of that.
Yeah, nature is a catalyst, isn't it, for a lot of game scenarios? I mean, you mentioned The Last of Us there. I mean, that certainly is the catalyst for that game, is the fungal infection. And obviously we're seeing that with viruses now, the fact that we're eating into ecospheres that we shouldn't be anywhere near, and we're mixing things together and sparking new forms of pandemics because of intermingling of certain viral infections in animals and species and humans and so forth. So it's a great backdrop for disaster, but in terms of ecology, it's far and few between, isn't it? I mean, in my story, Coalface, the two children, I call them children, I mean they're 15 years old, so they're teenagers. One of them wants to make an action game about a monster, and the girl character Amber, she wants to make an ecology game, and she's making a game because she's seeing all the protests going on in her town. Is back in the 80s, Save the Whale and C&D and all these kind of things that were around at the time. So she wants to make a little sort of ecology game, and she's called it Treemageddon. When this dragon does spread its smoke around the town and turns everything into kind of like a strange sort of nightmare dream-like scenario, the avatars of those two games sort of come into the world of the story. So Amber's avatar, which is a wooden tree girl, that kind of represents her game, and Tony's game is the dragon in the coal mine, and the two have to fix the situation that they've kind of both imagined these video games. So you have the kind of, I want to make action games, and you have, I want to make an ecology game, and the two things dovetail together as part of the story. I won't say too much more because there's spoilers, but there's a tension there because the wooden girl, Maybell, she wants to kill the creature, the dragon, because it's endangering nature and everything else. But there's a boy character who wants to save the dragon because he thinks the dragon's going to save their village, and it's going to allow them to dig more coal to sustain their father's jobs, and because they're going to work down the coal mine as well. So there's that tension of, just like we have today in the world, like in Germany, for example, there's that tension of, what about jobs and economies, and what about the environment, and that tension pulling in the context of a fantasy story.
On the gaming side, you tend to find with the larger companies, it's often just devolved to either a source for making their particular game, The Last of Us, for example. You could argue that there's a certain ecological message running through that. Or alternatively, it's just a simple game mechanic. If you take, say, Civilization 6, let's say, for example, where they've got quite a lot of mechanics and technological steps which involve the planet being ruined because you've got nothing but coal stations. But you can just buy yourself some dams, pop up a whole bunch of big walls, and the rising tide as it's coming to swoop away everything just doesn't. So the whole potential for adding a message there is undermined by the very idea that technology can resolve everything that is often present and as an underpinning mechanic for a civilization. So yeah, I think to answer the question directly, do we feel environmental issues are underrepresented in gaming? Yeah. I mean, given just how important it is as a core message for where we are today, and just how many games are generally viewed as escapism and little more.
That's what I was going to say. It hits a little too close to home. Like, oh no, I'm playing games or I'm reading books or fantasy, certainly to escape from the grim realities of what this century is likely to end up being. So yeah, it's I don't want to read about. I don't want to play a game that's preventing the Mad Max world. I want to enjoy the Mad Max world.
I love the Mad Max. Driving around the desert, smashing the ball.
Of course, who wouldn't love that?
Yeah,
But
I've been playing Biomutant recently, which is like Horizon Zero Dawn for Lindsay, for kids. And in fact, Matt Forbeck, a former guest of ours, I only found out when I played right through to the end and I was watching the credits and it was written by somebody in Matt Forbeck, and I was like, yay, Matt, go Matt. But that's exactly that. That's set after an apocalypse. Humans are extinct, and you're basically playing like a mutant rodent, kind of like the one from Rocket, and you get to pick and you get all your powers and stuff. But that is like the fun of it, is that you're playing in the wreckage of humanity, and they've got like little names like the Wizzly Whiz box for a telephone, or the Twanger for guitars and stuff. They've got like cute little names for the human artifacts that are left behind. But I don't want to play in the run up to that.
No, it'd be horribly depressing, wouldn't it? And it's one thing I have to be mindful when I'm writing this book. Is like I said, during a kind of slightly depressing era, but you've got to find the fun in engagement in the story. Otherwise, people will just think, "What's this preachy rubbish you're throwing, ramming down my throat?" It's got to be an adventure. It's got to be in a fantasy. Otherwise, you're just making a documentary. But coming back to The Last of Us, sometimes you play some games and. When you have that emotional resonance and you think, oh, this is like, it's really striking a chord with me. There was that moment in the first Last of Us game where the game slows down and you see the animals walking through the city and it's all overgrown and there's no more action or threat and it's just the beauty of nature. And I thought it was a great, the pacing of that game, if you had like your charts, like spiking in terms of tension, conflicts and so on, and then it slows down to this beautiful, this beautiful moments. That's one of the. I always remember that moment.
It's amazing. So I haven't played The Last of Us. So there are many games that I play, and there are some games I don't play, but I do watch Andy play. So they're almost like a movie to me, a very long extended movie. And Last of Us is one of the ones that I watched him play rather than play myself, because I'm not very good with zombies. And every week, Andy will confirm that this is true. Every single week we've been watching The Last of Us, and I turn to him every week and I say, "But when will I see the giraffes? When are they coming?"
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Are we going to get the spoilers? Spoilers.
We're going to get the CG.
There might be giraffes.
And also another thing I love in games, and it's Mark's escapism again, is some of my friends make fun of me because I play Skyrim over and over and over and over. And the reason why I play Skyrim over and over and over again is I just love being in the nature. I just like being in the world, and I spend a lot of time. When I go on holiday, I tend not to go to big cities and things. I like to go to mountains. I spend a lot of time in places like Austria and Bavaria, hiking in mountains and going into forests and stuff. And I always used to say, oh, this is like being in Skyrim, or oh, look at that looks like a bit of Skyrim, or the little German tavern looks a bit like something like the Nord's taverns in Skyrim, which is obviously that's what they're basing it all on. I just love to lose myself in virtual nature when I can't be in real nature. So video games are great for that aspect, feeling nourished by being in nature without being in nature. I mean, it's not just a real thing, but if you can't have a real thing, it's games are great.
Yeah, I mean that is the potential future where yes, the only place you'll get to see trees and forests is in a simulation.
That's very sad, but yes.
Well, I mean, unless we sort ourselves out.
Yeah, unless we sort it out.
And then we risk getting preachy about it, then, don't we?
Do you know,
perfectly timed.
Mark, it was read my mind. So, Rodricas, do you have any advice on how to handle people who call everything environmental preachy?
Well, I say when it bites you on the ass.
Yeah.
then you'll be joining the club. Preachy. Yeah, I mean it is a danger, isn't it? Because fundamentally, people want escapism. If you're not watching the news, which is bloody depressing all of the time, you want to get out of your head. You want to get away from your rubbish job and your terrible life essentially, and you want escapism. I completely understand that. But if you can put ideas into your escapism that might spark a little nugget of a concern or an idea or a conversation point. And sometimes, I've read or watched films or read books that I didn't quite get at the time because I wanted monsters and zombies and giant creatures. But there were certain things in those stories that I remember years later, and they do get into your subconscious and they do open up debate. And I think it's really important to open up discussion and debate with people. I mean, sometimes it's really hard. You don't get out there really big boots on and just argue with everyone all of the time, because I don't think that really wins any, friends or allies. I think it's good with entertainment if you can seed ideas into your escapism, and hope that you're just percolating and planting little seeds that will grow. And you keep fertilizing them, and then sooner or later you'll get a wave of ideas and a new way of looking at things and helping. So I think that's my personal approach.
There's enough banging of heads together in the political realms anyway.
Yeah, at the moment.
So anything we can do, I guess, as creatives, whether it's writers of games or fiction, to sort of see that and come at that from another angle, or certainly potentially inspire the next generation to kind of take these things a little bit more seriously or engage with them. I think that's kind of part of the job.
I mean, one thing I revisited recently is something I loved as a kid, and it was very eco-centric from the 1970s, and it was the film Silent Running. Have you seen it?
Oh God!
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I used to blubber and cry. With the one robot that. No, is a film from 1970s set in the future, and the Earth's environment has been ravaged by pollution and is destroyed. So they sent this very expensive space project into space, which has these great big gardens under domes, and it just flies around our galaxy with solar panels and stuff, and these gardens are sustained, and it's like the last of the Earth's species of flora and fauna. And there's a human crew. But there's also 3 robots that tend the gardens and look after things. They dig the earth and change the fertilizer and look after the animals. And the human crew are there to service the ship. But it's very expensive to run this big space project. And Earth has sent a message saying, "Oh, it's too expensive to run. We're going to destruct it. Come back to Earth and let the gardens go and die." But one of the astronauts is basically a space hippie, and he doesn't want to let all the gardens die, and so he murders the crew to save the gardens. But when you watch this film now, he comes across as like a bit of a madman. He's anthropomorphized the robots into other human beings that he plays cards with and stuff, and shouts at them and berates them and things like that. And you think, as an adult now, I think, that guy, is he a good guy, or is he a murdering lunatic?
Eco-terrorist, yes.
Exactly. But that's what happens with these kind of debates. If someone's savior is someone's terrorist and so forth, as you mentioned there, Mark. And that's the same with environmental debates. People think Extinction Rebellion are a load of nut jobs, damaging things and vandalizing paintings and stopping people get to work. And then for other people, they are, saviors, and they're trying to raise awareness. So that film, even though it's a very old film, is a great kind of debate point about, is that character a just character, a good character, is obviously morally all over the place. Interesting.
Yeah.
There's one here. So even recently I've seen Werewolf the Apocalypse dismissed for being too preachy. We've actually talked about Werewolf the Apocalypse a few streams ago now, quite a few, and said actually the problem with Werewolf is that, like, vampires are imaginary and werewolves are imaginary and mages are imaginary, but the issues in Werewolf the Apocalypse are not imaginary. And so it actually, and maybe when it was first published, it was more of a growing awareness of environmental issues. But I think now, like, we all know that, and it's not one big evil corporation, with black spiral dancers who are, and the worm at the heart of it. It's just humans, and actually, it makes Werewolf really sad for me, because the real world now feels worse than Werewolf. When I first started playing Werewolf, it didn't feel worse.
Wow, yeah.
Quite.
Yeah.
To loosely answer the question as well, there's quite a significant difference between creating material that's Captain Planet, as we're all saving the world from eco-horror, and here's our big gribbly bad guy who's just a personification of oil. And say, for example, as we discussed earlier, Mad Max or Dune, both of which have deep environmental messages run all the way through them, but are nevertheless cool as fuck settings. And we can engage with those settings, and throughout the course of those settings have all of the seeds sown for allowing whoever it is that's consuming the media to have a moment perhaps of reflection, particularly if those giraffe pauses are added. A moment of reflection where you can look at everything and go, well, holy shit, that means, well, huh. So it doesn't come across as preachy, but sometimes it just should be. I mean, I'm cool with it just being sometimes preachy.
Yeah, you can go the Hayao Miyazaki route, can't you? And then you can go the Fury Road route, and they seem like completely opposite ends of scale. You know, petrol heads, you know, shooting shit up, violence, and Mad Max. And I love Fury Road; it's one of my favorite films. And I love the old female biker gang that hold their bags of seeds and things, and they're wanting to they're Earth mothers basically, and the older women characters. Who can no longer, give life themselves, but they want to give life through the seeds that they have. And I thought that was a really powerful, metaphor for nature. But it's all wrapped up in, like as you said, it's all wrapped up in a kind of wham bam, one of the best action movies ever made.
Oh yeah.
And then you have, things like, Totoro and how Princess Mononoke and all that kind of stuff, which the Mad Max, a certain percentage of the Mad Max crowd will not want to watch, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But they both contain really interesting, great, amazing artistry and escapism and fantasy, but very different ends of the spectrum in terms of presenting. And
of course, we've talked about it off camera a lot, so I feel I must bring it up. The classic representation of the environmental battles between industrialization and the natural world is, of course, Saruman and the Ents.
Yes.
Yes. We did talk about that quite a bit.
We did.
Mark, you made me. Well, you didn't make me because it wasn't exactly a chore. But yesterday I went back and watched all the Saruman scenes in the Lord of the Rings movies, and I mean, that trilogy of films is just staggering. But the whole Saruman stuff, it's really well judged in terms of how they present that character. I mean, today it feels even more resonant now with the whole industrialization and cutting down the forests and the way he manipulates the other races in Middle Earth to say, they stole your homes over there. You payback time. You're going to take them out. And I love there's one scene where Saruman is trying to speed up production in his factories and beneath Isengard, and there's like one orc is like the middle manager orc who's going,
we can't manage this.
How did that orc get that position where he's like the
did he come in as an entry-level grunt?
No, Saruman poached him. He poached him from another. I think Mordor was kind of rearming at one point, and although they had like a non-competition clause between the Dark Tower and Isengard and Orthanc, he managed to he sort of managed to drag him over. That's the story I tell myself.
Do orcs? Do they go on strike? Do they
have a union?
Pay? Yeah, do they have a union? Orc union?
So many questions.
Yeah, Rando says, I'd argue that gaming in the post-apocalyptic Mad Max is escapism, the fantasy that you'd be one of the ones to survive and even flourish as a hero. It's the same delusion that people have that they would have been on the freedom rides in the 60s. Like most people weren't.
Yeah.
Or the same delusion that people could take a bear out with their bare hands.
Yeah.
You're wrong.
Well, I have a slight theory. The reason why the zombie genre is so huge partly is because it's that kind of like slightly kind of fever dream of being a survival nut, and you can shoot humans without any persecution or ramifications because they look like humans, but they're not.
But they're monsters.
Yeah, totally.
In there, isn't there, a little bit?
And pinging back to what Rango just said there regarding Mad Max being escapism, it shows how you can marry your environmental issue material with all manner of different forms of escapism. It's all about how you frame it, and different people are going to want to consume very different styles of media. And I think that was really nicely summed up there. The vast range of different ways you can present it and still have that ecological message running through it without it feeling like it is necessarily preachy. Although some people are also going to look for that preachy material because they just want to consume that because they feel like they need to do something, and it speaks very much to the message that they think needs to be presented.
Let's take a change of tone. So Killer Chandler has asked, are the undead a good vehicle for bringing environmental issues to the fore in fantasy? Could medieval have some wonderful subtext about reduce, reuse, recycle?
Yeah, I guess. I knew this was going to come up. Well, Sony likes to recycle medieval, so we certainly.
Nicely done.
I'm recycling my PlayStation 2 mug. I've still got that going.
Yeah, I think zombies Yeah, I mean, the thing about zombies are they're almost a blank canvas for anything you want to project onto them. You know, the zombie genre. You know, The Last of Us is zombies basically. And one of my favorite. I was going to bring. I put a little pile of films next to me because I was going to say, just pop them up now and again. One of my favorites. I wouldn't call it like a heavy-handed environmentalist film. Again, we're going back to the 1970s again here. But this is a zombie film that is all about environmentalism, and it's called The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue.
I have not seen that.
Let Sleeping Corpses Lie in the US. And in this movie, it was made in 1974. It's an Italian-Spanish co-production filmed in the Lake District of the UK. And it's about an experimental harvest machine that sends out sort of ultrasonic sounds to kill the insects that are destroying crops. And the main character is like an art dealer, sort of hippie motorbike guy, who's so cockney and is so sexist and so 1970s. But his heart's in the right place, but he is very, very sexist. I will warn you now if you watch it. But anyway, he stumbles across this environmental machine, and he's outraged by it because he's like saying, we should leave the crops for the insects, which is what we do. We shouldn't be messing with nature. And so this machine sends out these ultrasonic waves that kills off insects and it makes them eat each other. But it also happens to resurrect the nearby local dead. So,
of course,
environmental message, properly environmental message with zombies. So to answer your kind of like zombie, doesn't necessarily medieval, but but that is one of the I think one of my favorite environmental message zombie movies, and it's The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue. Check it out, but be warned, it's of its time.
One of my favorite films that is not exactly what it is World War Z. So obviously it's a zombie film, but it's actually a pandemic film. It's about a global pandemic. One of the things I love about it is with I was going to say Brad Pitt's character. Brad Pitt. That's one of the things I love.
Understood.
Yeah, it's so you follow his character through it, and I don't want to give spoilers. Well, one, I love the 12th man in the Israeli, so the person who's just employed to think about all the crazy things and come up with the I would really like that to be my job. That would be amazing. But the second thing is there's one part of it where Brad Pitt has to leave some people behind. And he's been working in refugee camps. He's been a non-governmental organization person working for the UN for his whole professional life, and that's part of the reason he's brought in. And someone says to them, "Yeah, but they're in a refugee camp. They're going to be fine." And he's just like, "They're not." But they're not, and then obviously has to spend the rest of the film fighting to get them back. And I just thought that was really heartbreaking, because the whole of his rest of his professional life, he's been making these compromises. He's been working for non-governmental organization. He's been trying to make a difference, but fundamentally, he knows the places he's been working in weren't safe for women and children. And it's like the most heartbreaking bit of that film, just to see even the people who are really trying to do the right things are constrained by the absolute volume of badness around them. So it's a great pandemic film. It may be like not. I watched it before COVID and I thought it was excellent, and I was like, "This is what will happen if we have a pandemic." It didn't quite come to pass, thankfully, but it could have done.
Well, that was the fascinating. That was the fascinating thing about lockdown and the pandemic, wasn't it? Because suddenly all these movies, became almost felt like instruction manuals for the times to come. I mean, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. I'm sure you've seen it, but there are lots of scenes in Dawn of the Dead, the original Romero film, which are set in TV series with scientists debating all the different aspects of this pandemic and people not following the rules and getting more and more out of control. And then they're talking about what extreme measures can we take to contain this thing. And some of those TV broadcasts in Dawn of the Dead really felt and sounded like the debates and situations we were seeing unfold during COVID.
Yeah, completely. The whole concept of zombies being this epitome of consumption and this almost capitalist idea, I think it would be, to go back to the original question, almost a nice way of reimagining things. That whole idea of reusing our our undead bits,
I love
reuse
this.
and recycling them.
I love this comment from Infinite Saxon because anyone who has played a simulation game will understand the pain, right? I love the way a typical city skyline playthrough models the challenges or perhaps impossibility of sustainable urban expansion. But like any simulation game is like that. You start off with all of these like really great intents. So like whenever I do a city simulation, I think of myself like a Soviet era city planner, like a school has to be within X block, X amount. And obviously in the Soviet era, they did things like they just bulldozed whole housing complexes to do that because it was a totalitarian state. I wouldn't necessarily do that, although obviously in The Sims, I am the totalitarian state master, and so I can. But like you start off with these really, really good intentions, and it just gets too big to manage.
Every
Yes.
time.
Every single time.
That's so true, isn't it? I mean, I used to go to music festivals a lot, and sometimes you go to kind of like the hippiest of the music festivals, and then when you leave the music festival, because it's obviously so oversubscribed, it's just a wasteland of plastic.
Oh God, yeah.
And you think you just listen to loads of people on stage talking about all these kind of like recyclable things and new age things and blah blah blah, and then the people, like the swarm of locusty people, have come in and just like left all their crap. It's just go, well, we're doomed.
Yeah, people are the worst.
You tend to find that a lot of computer games as well, they're purposely designed to have that tension between trying to do everything well and it all collapsing under the weight of the things that have to be done. And they'll present some form of infinite mode where effectively it's designed to come to an end. If you take, say, a game like, say, Frostpunk, which some of you may or may not know, which has quite a strong environmental image with the entire world freezing over because of the, let's say, the effects of humanity upon it. And you go off to the north where it's even colder for stupid reasons. It's a bit of a silly game. But nevertheless, that game, as you're going through a host of London-based folks just dying and dying and dying and dying. And no matter how well you start off, you end up going, yep, well, anyone with a broken leg, you fucked out. And I'm going to pass a new law. I'm going to pass a new law. Anyone that's not working, they're out too. You're not working, out you go. And it's just to keep civilization moving under these horrible circumstances. But yeah, many games do that very well. Pardon?
Sounds like the kind of the Nazis.
Yeah, it's awful. It's actually awful. And they all start with these wonderful, oh, it's quite warm. Everything's going to go well. Winter comes and it goes terrible. And it's interesting to see that. It has a very strong message running all the way through. Again, about environmental and also human governmental issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Infinite Saxon by default clean technological options for things like water treatment or electricity generation are locked, and the player must come back later to undo their earlier damage. I don't know. When I play a sim, I just find like you get this gold. You're like 2 bits ago, not necessarily whatever you measure that game in. Like 2 bits ago, I was on the cusp of a golden age. It could have been beautiful if I can only go back to 2 bits ago and redesign my whole city, and I spend the whole game doing that. Just restarting and being like this time it will be different. I'm like the worst god ever. I'm just constantly destroying my creations and starting again.
I mean, history shows through human evolution societies, empires falling and rising and falling and rising and falling. It's there's the ebb of city building, I guess, and civilization. So is that you're talking about a game microcosm of that natural state of event.
You cannot play Frostpunk without feeling like a horrible person in the end. I couldn't watch Andy play it. It was too
Which is again, as we started with, there's a reason people don't want too much of that in their gaming, because it's escapism and the harsh reality of having to make terrible choices about, the population you're manipulating. It's just like, there's enough of that going on. I have to, in the outside world, I need a little safe space for my gaming.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so let's take a different turn again and do something. Seagoat has asked, if the D&D trope is the party looting and pillaging their way across the world, how do you make the party loot and pillage in an environmentally friendly manner? So I do have an answer to this, but it's actually the other way around than you would think, Seagoat. So Andy and I spent many years playing a vampire campaign. in which my character lived in multiple parts of Europe. She lived in Transylvania, she lived in Sighishuara, she lived in Kodlea, she lived in Marseille. And I know quite a lot about these places in Europe because I spent all my time researching them on the internet, looking at pictures of them. And as a result, Andy and I didn't actually go to those places. So think of our carbon footprint and how much smaller it was because he's such a great GM. Now, when I meet people, I actually genuinely want to say, "Oh my God, you're from like Brasov." I didn't used to live there. Don't say that. Don't tell them you used to live there.
I completely understand that, because that's one of the reasons why I love playing the Assassin's Creed games. Is the Egyptian game had like a tourist mode where you would just go on tours, like you were on a walking tour, you're guided around all these great sites. They've done a lot of research to recapture with museums and so forth. And also the Assassin's Creed, I think it was Assassin's Creed 2, the one in Venice, that, you know, I played that game to death. And then years later, when I did go to Venice, I felt like I literally did know my way around Venice from playing Assassin's Creed 2.
It's happened. Andy and I have these conversations in restaurants, and I just like worry for the people around us. I'll be like, "Do you remember that time we were in Vienna and I met Leoric and there was that guy drowning in the canal, and I was on like the path of death, so I was really fascinated with death then, so we just watched that guy drown."
Totally.
And he's like, yeah, I remember that. Leoric, what a guy. Secondhand samurai says, yeah, rent is cheaper in imaginary houses and they're cheap to heat. I am late to the party, but is that Darth Gibbons?
I have gone to the dark side, yes.
Yeah,
it's actually very chilly here in Southern California for a change. And still,
is it really though? Is it though?
No.
Really?
No, it's just my blood has thinned in the 18 years, whatever it is I've been here. We do have snow. I can see snow on the mountains from the end of my street. So it is actually, you know, that brief season when Southern California is something other than brown and dusty.
I was going to say, if you're finding LA cold, you're losing your Welshness, Mark.
Oh, I know. I'm well aware of it. I can't come home in the winter. I can only come home in the summertime. Last time I was back, it was the end of October, beginning of November, and that was challenging. I was in Edinburgh, which was particularly challenging.
He did almost die. We had to take him to a pub to feed him alcohol.
Yes, that's the excuse.
Repeatedly.
Yes, constantly, pretty much.
That's the way it should be, though.
Siegel has come up with his own answer based on our rambling. So more in-depth descriptions to make the players feel like they're actually there. Yes, I'll pass over to Andy Law because he can tell you about the game that he ran for us during lockdown and the way he made us feel like there were real world consequences. So he doesn't remember. So
No, I do. No, I'm actually going to bring
really
up.
Clever.
I'm going to bring up and directly answer the question. Ooh, controversial. So how do you make the party loot and pillage in an environmentally friendly manner? Consequences. Mm-hmm. Consequences. So whether you're writing a story, whether you're creating a scenario, whether you're building some sort of game mechanic in place, you can add consequences to their rampant consumption of whatever it is that they are bulldozering their way through. And if you wish to add that message underpinning it, you can add if you do all these things, it has repercussions and it does all these other things. And what Lindsay was mentioning was exactly that, where when we were in lockdown, we set ourselves up effectively out. Let's role play in a village and we'll do lots of villagey things. And there's a big plot going on in the background. And each week, various NPCs had issues and problems, and they were a limited party, so they could only resolve one or two of those things. And it meant the other things didn't get resolved. But I told them what happened to all the things that they didn't do as people died and things went wrong. And suddenly their decision-making processes changed from the ones that may have started off with, we'll go for the high heroic thing over there. There's somebody going, I'm off to save this guy's kid. Because that's important.
One week, the choice was, there was 3 choices, and I can only remember 2 of them, but one of them was the town's supply of like beer is late. So do you want to go out and find, you know, the trading party that must have lost that beer? And the other one was like someone's missing in the marsh. And then the next week, it was like, well, that person didn't come back. And as a result, like one person went to look for them by himself, and he's now dead, and his children have no one. It was awful. Like I felt so But
Lovely
it
and
does really
grim.
make us think about like the impact we wanted to have on the world.
I think going back to marrying that with the zombie question someone asked earlier about recycling and so forth, but there's that great line again going back to Romero's Dawn of the Dead, where because in the context of Romero's films, it's not necessarily the infection or the bite that turns you a zombie; it's just dying turns you into a zombie. And there's a great line where a religious priest, says at the beginning of the film, we must stop the killing or lose the war. Meaning that in America, because so many people have guns and they're shooting each other up to loot and steal stuff, and thus creating more living dead, is the adding to the problem. So again, it's kind of it's almost like an environmental management system of zombies. So it was this great little line. It was really nice. The rules of the game, if it was a game, essentially.
Yeah, I like that.
If the orc camp is destroying a forest and you loot and pillage a camp, then that's environmentally friendly. Don't get me started on the Beastmen and Warhammer. It's not worth it.
It's been a recurring theme, isn't it? What happens to the
And
peaceful
Long
forest
Shadow says consequences. That's the bar that should be set for everything to make it engaging. Kudos for making people think. And 101 Colonel said, is it the original Dawn of Dead or the 2004 remake?
The original 1978 Dawn of the Dead. The remake had no subtext at all.
It pretty much was the text.
I mean, Lara Croft never been called to account for all those endangered species she murders across, half a dozen video games. She's just
dinosaurs.
British aristocracy. British aristocracy just getting away with it. No price.
Yeah, Mark, I that's true. I mean, I know there's been a little bit of a mini backlash against things like Indiana Jones and Lara Croft because of all the discussions about artifacts being stolen and taken to very powerful nations and put on display, and people robbed of their culture. But yeah, the dinosaur thing is interesting, isn't it? Because I remember when I used to watch the old Ray Harryhausen movies when I was a kid, and they had all the dinosaurs and exotic creatures and dragons and things. And every time a monster, same with King Kong, when you had the kind of the Westerners going to the Skull Island and just shooting up all the Stegosauruses and things like that, and it's a dinosaur, kill it. And I, as a child, I don't know where this empathy came from, because I wasn't necessarily taught it about environmental concerns. But every time a monster died, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I would almost cry. I think I probably did cry. I cried when Kong died in the original film. I cried when Ray Harryhausen's monsters were killed. There was a dragon in one of the Sinbad films that is shot with a great big...
Oh, yeah.
Just wrong.
Yeah, cried at that. And so when I eventually did meet Ray Harryhausen at a talk in Cambridge, and he said, has anybody got any questions? In that kind of nice voice he had. And I said, yes, sir. I said, didn't you feel guilty for killing all those monsters in the movies? Because I love those monsters and you killed them all. And he thought about it. Interesting question. And he thought, no, one of them lived, the giant turtle in 10 million years BC. And I thought about that. And I remember the end of the film, everything explodes into lava and volcanoes. So that poor turtle probably boiled in the sea. Yeah.
I'm a bit jealous you met Ray Harryhausen.
Creatures, monsters. Yeah.
So there are, next week, we've almost come to the end of this week, so there's not enough time to talk about the Beastmen and Warhammer, but next week we will be talking to Andy Hall about adapting Warhammer, so I might talk about the Beastmen.
Return of the Beastmen.
The Return of the Beastmen. Right, so wow, it's an hour has, as always, whizzed by very quickly. Do we have time for a very short final question?
Yeah, you got a minute. Go for it.
A minute. In a minute, sum up how we can create ethical products in this area of easiest, cheapest.
Fuck me.
Okay, that's not going to happen, is it?
Well, I did think when we were going to talk about eco gamer and green gamer, I think, we're going to talk about actually the real world stuff, the consequences of plastic production and shipping from China and all that. I'm glad we didn't, because zombies is far more interesting for a friendly chat. But yeah.
There was no Ent discussion.
Yeah, there wasn't.
There
we
was
missed
not
our
a
Ents.
protracted
Well, we got onto orc middle management, and
that's true. Yeah, management.
Because Lindsay's theory about the Ent wives, we didn't discuss that.
Oh no, we didn't.
Discuss that.
It's a good one too.
So, yeah, but we
don't
have
my
time for
Christopher story.
That. Or
Christopher Lee story. You're gonna have to come back for another show. It's gonna have to happen.
Mark's heard it before.
I can't recall it. I don't remember it.
It was when we went to a Lord of the Rings signing event in London for the Two Towers, the DVD launch. I went down with my friend Pete Giles, And the queue was enormous. I mean, oh my God, the queue goes around the block to see Christopher Lee. And the security said, okay, no talking to Mr. Lee, just hand your DVD over and go and then get out, no interactions, you'll sign your thing, that's it. And I had gone there with a little kind of side quest. So I had but my side quest was to get my Wicker Man box set signed. I have this very limited edition wooden box set. And I know it's Christopher Lee's favourite film, so I thought, you'll have no qualm signing it. I'm a huge fan of him and the film. So we queued up and we got to the table, and I started like shaking because I saw Christopher Lee, and it was like basically queuing up to see the headmaster of a school. And I felt like I'd been really naughty and I'd done something wrong. And I got to the counter and I got my Wicker Man out of my bag and my hands were shaking. And my friend Pete was filming on his tiny little 2002 era digital camera. And I put the Wicker Man on this table, and he was sitting by this big desk, and he looked at me, and he was like, and I said, excuse me, Mr. Lee, could you please sign my Wicker Man box set? And suddenly the security came out of nowhere and just grabbed the box set and ran off with it. And I was stood there floundering in front of Christopher Lee. And then he looked at me and he said, I cannot possibly sign that. And I was like, oh, no, he's talking to me. I was told not to speak. And so I said, why not, Mr. Lee? And he said, well, you see, I would get into trouble. And then he did this, I'm not joking, he said, I would get into trouble. And he pointed at me like that and he said, and so would you too. And I was like, I was sweating. I was like, oh my God, he's telling me off in front of everyone. And I don't know. I said, I'm really sorry, Mr. Lee. I've got Lord of the Rings as well. And I got my Two Towers DVD out and felt stupid and put it on the table and he signed it. And he's like, well, you see, it's in my contract. I'm not allowed to sign anything other than the Lord of the Rings. And he slid it back. But then I said to Christopher Lee, I was pushing him out, I said, oh, sorry, Mr. Lee, is it possible my friend could take a photograph of us? So I've got this terrible, like, blurry, super low-res photograph of me looking really nervous with Christopher Lee just staring.
Did you get your Wicker Man box set back? Like your Wicker Man?
I did. I had to go and find the blooming bouncer that I'd stolen it, and I had to go and get it back off him. Yeah, well, but at least I had an interaction. Yeah, after all.
There you go.
Well, there we go. That we did get to hear the Christopher Lee story, and that is an excellent note to end the stream on. So thank you so much for joining us, Jason. It's been great to meet you and hear some of your stories, and we would love to have you back another time. Next week, as I said, we're talking to Andy Hall about adapting Warhammer. And until then, thank you so much to all our viewers. Thank you to my guests. Thank you to all our patrons who make this possible. And thank you to our Discord community and everyone who pre-submitted questions. Until the next time, all that remains for me to say is good night and caw-caw, caw-caw.
Ta-ra!
Bye.
Bye-bye.